start with, you know, journalism is not a profession in the way academic life is a profession. It's a business. And journalists are not licensed. You don't have to have any educational credential to be a journalist. So it's much more like if you were asking, why do we let people practice business if they may or may not have studied economics? You know, it's we as a society have made a decision that we want to have this be a sort of libertarian realm. You could fix the problem if you think it's a problem by saying, okay, from now on we're going to do what our society did with, you know, in the 19th century you could say, hey, I'm a doctor. let's go to the OR right now. But then we decided we didn't want that anymore. Same with being a professor. You didn't have to have a PhD. So we, you know, the kind of simple solution to what you're suggesting, which I do not think will happen and maybe shouldn't happen, would be to say, let's make journalism a profession like the other professions who require a certain kind of professional education and licensing, et cetera, and go back, you know, as I was mentioning before, to regulating broadcasting. If you've decided not to do that, you get a lot of chaos and fake news and stuff like that. Narrowly on the question you're asking, I believe you can practice journalism in a responsible way. Yes, the field is structured mostly to switch from topic to topic, but I still think there are teachable skills that let you do that pretty well, including dealing with experts a lot and checking your work with them. So you wouldn't have to say you have to specialize. If you did say normatively you should specialize, then we have to invent an entire economic and professional structure like you have in the academy to support that, because it doesn't exist now. But it's too facile to say all journalism is about entertainment, because it's not. There's a lot of good journalism coming out every day. There's a lot of different parts of journalism, and there's a lot of good journalists. So I don't think you should be, as an academic, too quick to say, I'm horrified that a field this unstructured can exist and the result is inevitably total chaos. One other point, I myself, I mean, I think it's a total waste of time as a journalist to be a White House correspondent. I just don't, it's just theater, you know. I mean, Jim Acosta's good at it, he's very courageous, but it's not what I would call real journalism to just get up and raise your hand and say, Mr. President, why did you say that? And you're not going to really find out anything. You're just going to get Trump to act like the jerk, which he did. And it wouldn't defend, you know, kicking him out, taking his mic away, taking away his credentials. But to me, the least, not the least, but low on the level of socially useful functions of journalism would be spending your day in that little room in the White House so that every once in a while, when there's a press avail, you can get up and ask the aggressive question. That's just not what God put us here on earth to do.
No, that's great.
Okay. Yeah.
William Neville. I was actually in.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead. No, I thought I was going to ask you first and then you next. Okay.
Okay, you want me to go first? Yeah, so I'm Parker. I'm a first-year master's student in political science. My question is kind of, there was a story on Tuesday in the New York Times about the sort of beginning of the opioid crisis and how it came into the national media. And so the way that it got started, if you're not familiar with it, is a series of videos were sort of posted online from just individuals that saw people overdosing on heroin, police departments that would post people having overdosed, and they would be very graphic videos. But before those videos were posted, there was no real national conversation about an opioid crisis. After they started to come out, national sort of reporters started to pay attention to the issue. They sort of started to take it more seriously. And I'm interested in your thoughts on whether you think journalism sets the agenda for the United States or the world, or whether or not you get your cues from other conversations that are happening online or conversations that you hear. Because I think, at least in political science, we're really interested in sort of the causal direction of what the institution of media does, whether it sets an agenda or whether it sort of pulls its cues from other people. Can you sort of shed some light on your thoughts on it? Or?
I mean, okay, so first thing to say is, almost everything happening in the world is not covered at all by the press.
Sure.
Remember how selective the press is. So only a few things get elevated on the agenda. And second, you know, it's not that useful to talk about the media because, as I've been saying, it's such a huge, disorganized, shaggy, chaotic world. So there are examples. I would say a really, really good example is Me Too, which pretty much got ignited by one New York Times story, as far as I could tell. So that's a great example. But I think it's a misleading example because most of the time, for reasons we've been discussing, the press is sort of absorbing the conventional wisdom and using that to set an agenda rather than sitting down and saying, let's set the agenda, and now we're going to do it, and then it sticks. That's not very descriptive of how the media ecosystem works.
Yeah, and I think I've said that, you know, people, you know, storylines kind of emerge, you know, and
There's this
people.
great term, lifeys, that Neil Gabler invented. That's like a real life storyline.
Right.
People grab onto a lifey and, you know, like the caravan. You know,
Yeah,
it's
right, and I think, you know, journalists consume a lot of the writing of other journalists, so that's partly, you know, what informs them. And I also think certain stories kind of gain attention at a certain point because they fit they somehow, you know, the opioid crisis is a real thing. It also it also became a kind of way of talking about Trump, or kind of like talking about the people who voted for Trump. It became part of this it became part of this storyline, and I think that's part of what, and I think that's what happens at certain points. Like, things happen, and people kind of coalesce around, journalists coalesce around certain frameworks for kind of understanding those things, you know. And I think that the kind of notion of kind of like, oh, you know, things out there for the white working class are a lot worse than maybe, you know, people on the coast recognized, and there's all this, and this is connected to the fact that they're willing to vote for Donald Trump. I think that also helped to promote the opioid epidemic into a storyline that seemed to kind of fit the moment.
But you know, if you're going to be a political scientist who studies the media, you should really check yourself every time you feel yourself typing the words, the media decided this, the media decided to do this, because that's just not life as we experience it, except in very rare cases.
Is there a more precise way of talking about the media then? How would we sort of
No,
refer to
well,
the general like concept, I guess?
Okay,
I'm
so I mean,
interested.
it's just like classic social science stuff,
Sure.
like, you know, define your terms. What is your data set here? You cannot talk about the media. I mean, I was reading some study where they said 5 million Americans claim to be journalists, you know, of which 4-point-something million are just tweeting and blogging and stuff.
Right.
So if you're going to say the media, you
Sure.
have to narrow the frame and say, here's exactly who I'm talking about, and I'm going to now gather data on this particular set and do sort of ethnographic interviewing, content analysis, etc. But be really careful about the media.
Just, I mean, obviously,
too big.
You know, this issue of framing, whether or not it's the media or covering a story, is something that infects what all of us do. I mean, certainly in political theory, there's framing that's going on since the beginning of time, and it's a different focus for the frame, anyway.
And again, I mean, you just wouldn't believe, it's very hard to make non-journalists believe how reactive the media is and how absorptive of conventional wisdom. If you went to the New York Times Daily Story Conference, you would be bewildered because, you know, roughly speaking, you know, Dean Baquet or Joe Kahn is sitting at a table, all these assistant managing editors troop in. Dean says, what do you got for me? 50 stories get pitched. He then says, okay, these 6 are going on the front page. Meeting's over in 15 minutes. If you said to him, how did you decide? He'd say, gut. I just went with my gut, you know. It's just really hard to process if you're not in that world how completely instinctive it is with often bad results, sometimes good results, but there's no rigorous process to make that decision of which of the 50 aspirants to the front page of the New York Times get on the front page.
Yes.
So I have sort of two questions I'm going to, they're linked, at least in my opinion they are. So like, you know, when it comes to some journalistic stories that sort of challenge government narratives, you know, what's sort of the relationship between our political knowledge and, you know, stories that are being officiated or not officiated by the government? And then where does, as a follow-up, it's like, where does self-censorship come into like the media and its relationship to political knowledge it's willing to talk about?
In my life, I have not seen a lot of self-censorship. I think this conventional wisdom or framing thing is much, much, much more powerful. And otherwise, there are these kind of structural incentives. Like, you're in the meeting with Dean Baquet. You're an AME, you want your story on the front page. How do you get on the front page? You say, by the way, Dean, the Washington Post is on this story. Oh, whoops, it's on the front page. So, you know, it's not these like, what does the government want? What are policymakers asking for? It's just, I want to beat the competition. I want to win a prize. Almost everything that wins Pulitzer Prizes would not be published if there were no Pulitzer Prizes. I cannot tell you how important, I speak as one who was on the Pulitzer Prize board for 10 years. I can't tell you how important that is in the culture of journalism. It's just supremely important. So, I mean, especially in kind of like mainstream news organizations, maybe less the New Republic, I just haven't been in those conversations. And then there's also these narrative imperatives. You know, a lot of the questions that get asked on go, no-go with the story is, you know, so you want to write a story about Professor Wallach, the question isn't, are his views acceptable within, you know, the frame that we've accepted from, you know, our owner or government. It's more like, let's see, will he talk to you? Will he spend time with you? Is he interesting? Does he have weird, interesting hobbies you can write about? You know, it's kind of those narrative imperatives of, is this a person you can sort of bring to life as a character in a story? And it's very hard from the outside, again, to see how powerful that is in the decision-making in news organizations.
I agree with that, all that, but I do think that a lot of, you know, there are a lot of unstated assumptions that then get, you know, kind of are, that undergird some of these things. So like I'm just thinking about, like, let's say you feel like, okay, we've got this story that it turns out that North Korea is not complying with its promise to shut down some nuclear reactor, or the Chinese are not enforcing the sanctions on North Korea that we thought, and they're still getting into that. It's like, so that would be a good story, and so like you figured out there's something happening which is different than what people said, and I think that would, you know, people would write that story and be pleased about it. But then I feel like the question that wouldn't be asked very often is like, why should we care whether North Korea is building nuclear weapons? Like, why do we care? Like, I guess the answer would be, well, we care because the United States government cares. The United States government has said, like, this is a big problem. But I feel like I don't even think it's thought about at that level. I think that if people were to say, like, we're agnostic about whether it matters, but we're writing about it because the government says it's a problem, and therefore that makes it a story. But I think what basically just gets kind of brought into the story as an unquestioned assumption is that, like, North Korea having nuclear weapons is something we should be really worried about. And that's debatable. Like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, you know? And I feel like that is the kind of thing, and I think most journalists, like, by nature, are just not necessarily the kind of people, I think this is what I'm saying, they're not the kind of people necessarily, and they're not in the kind of institutional cultures that would lead them to spend a lot of time thinking about that. It would be more like, as you see, all the smaller questions. Well, can you verify that? Like, what are the details? Like, do you have the story? Like, can you? And in some ways, I feel like there can be a little missing of the forest for the trees sometimes.
And journalists get bored very easily. I mean, when I worked at the Washington Post was in the heyday of Ben Bradley. The happiest I ever saw him was the day that Gene Harris killed the Scarsdale diet doctor. You know, and he was like walking through the news, that's a hell of a goddamn story. I love this goddamn story. And then the owner, Mrs. Graham, was on this commission on the future of Europe called the Brandt Commission, and which was doing very important work. And she'd come down to the newsroom and say, Ben, I want you to write about the Grant Commission, and sort of roll his eyes, and everybody in the newsroom would say, oh my God, she wants us to write about that boring Grant Commission, you know? So it's a lot of it's just very adrenaline-driven and narrative-driven, and there's less sort of thinking about this kind of stuff consciously than you might think. There's a book, a wonderful old book by Herb Gans called Deciding What's News, where he did a lot of embedding with news organizations and really watched these decisions being made about, you know, what gets featured, what doesn't, in what ways. It's quite useful. There isn't anything, I don't think, as good, you know, about that that's written from the inside.
Good. Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, this is a question that often gets asked, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Identify yourself. You.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Glenn Spear. I'm from the history department. And because as I said, it's something that people ask about. What's the future of journalism, more particularly political journalism? That's what we're talking about. And, you know, we all know the papers are folding, news staffs are out the door, the advent of internet, and the 5 million journalists that you were talking about, journalists, and the vying between entertainment and whatever more serious discussion is. And I'm not against entertainment. I mean, I find politics entertaining when I read about it on any level. So I'm just curious how you're looking at things going forward.
I bet Nick will have a better answer on this than I
Well,
do.
I would say, you know, newspapers are really dying, and more than you see if you're in New York. So that's really important and really bad. You
Is
know,
even a paper like the Times in some kind of
you
danger?
know,
or-
the official
it's
answer
clear
is
that
the
things
Times is
evolve.
safe and the Times has made it. So first of all, that's a misleading example because, you know, go read the Chicago Tribune or the LA Times and they're just, wow, they're so different from what they were.
Really?
Even the Times, I'm not as sanguine about. So I think what will happen is, if by political journalism you mean serious political journalism,
Well, serious and, you know, the entertainment value, just the coverage of politics.
I mean, CNN seems pretty survivable to me. Print repertorial political journalism, I think, is rapidly migrating to a sort of new but small but growing not-for-profit sector, and to you know, a model that's always
What were
been
you
around.
thinking of? I mean, the only thing that pops in my head is
ProPublica.
Harper's.
No, well, Harper's is one. ProPublica.
Oh, okay.
Texas Tribune,
Okay.
Center for Investigative Reporting, you know, Center for Public Integrity. There's a lot of these.
Okay.
There's a little ecosystem that's coming up, and then you know, just wealthy patrons like Steve Jobs' widow, who owns the Atlantic now, and these folks have always owned newspapers, but they, because of inequality of more billionaires, and so the percent of serious journalism that's owned by billionaires for non-economic reasons is probably higher than it's been in a long time. Some of them are benign. We've been in that movie before.
Yes, yes, yeah,
Some of them aren't, you know.
yeah.
Do you want to say?
No, it's good.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Well, maybe a related question.
I want to say I have to go in a few minutes.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot to say that in the beginning. Both of them have to leave shortly after 6. So
So
we'll
with,
take the questions.
the economics of online publishing,
Mhm.
it seems like that's encouraged this explosion of commentary, even as reporting, like shoe leather stuff that takes a lot of resources, but seems to be dwindling. So I'm wondering how you see that, and if maybe there's some aggregate effect on like American
You're
political
right.
discourse.
But we're in a moment, I mean, this is the problem. So yes, you're right in terms of the push, you know, there's more. However, overstating the case, but I don't think that much until somebody shows me, you know, audited books. All online journalism loses money, and it's always lost money, and everybody who says it makes money is lying. So we're now in a moment when people are finally figuring that out, and BuzzFeed is for sale. You know, when I was dean, I had to go to these constant meetings where HuffPost, they figured it out. BuzzFeed, they figured it out. Vox, they figured it out. you know, they all lose money. So the model, you're right, but the larger point is the model doesn't work. So you had this kind of spike where a lot of capital flowed into these businesses, but now it's flowing out. So it doesn't solve the problem, even though it created another problem that you're right to mention.
But I do think that one difference, you know, you're right that the relationship of the amount of reporting to the amount of commentary is radically different than it was in the 1980s. I assigned, my students here will know, I assigned one of the pieces I asked them to write is this piece that Michael Kinsley wrote called William Shawn and the Temple of Facts, where, so basically he's upset that the New York Times is giving you too many facts, and he's basically saying the facts are meaningless, we need more commentary to try to make sense of these facts, right? And I feel like students often like read it as if it's from a different, you know, a different universe, you know, so I think in some ways it makes a place like the New York Times and Washington Post more important in a professional sense. It's like they basically give a set of facts, and then a million people kind of, you know, descend on that. I think one of the things that is, you know, there's been a little bit of, you know, discussion among journalists recently about the apparent demise of the Weekly Standard. Some people saying it's good, they brought us the Iraq War, you know, to hell with them. But, you know, one thing you could say about the Weekly Standard, which is, you know, and I think it on places, it was a conservative publication. It did a lot of just, you know, conservative editorializing that I generally didn't agree with, but they actually also did some reporting. Like, they did narrative reporting, they sent out people to find out what was going on. Sometimes it's useful to have conservative reporters because they have better sources among Republicans and could do interesting stuff to tell you what's going on. And like, you know, Breitbart is not doing that.
Do you want to? I'm not kicking you out, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, I know you all got to run. My question actually, humorously enough, relates back to the Weekly Standard's, I guess, co-founder or founder. Did Bill Kristol found it properly?
Yes.
Or did he? Okay, so, and well, really it has to do with an earlier topic like I brought up, which is like the kind of gadfly.
Oh, you know, by the way, but he didn't get into graduate school.
What, who, Bill Kristol?
Yeah.
What do you mean he didn't get into graduate school?
He tried to get into graduate school in philosophy. And he didn't
Oh, you're talking about teaching in graduate schools?
No, to go to graduate school.
His mother taught here.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, I was confused, because I know he, like, you know, did
That's right. I mean,
PhD.
not to put him down. Not to put him down. I mean, he was all.
He's a Harvey Mansfield student, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
let's go to the question.
yeah, I'm just, my mind, I mean, I'm kind of thinking about George Will, and I'm thinking about Bill Kristol, and not just Kristol's father, but all those people, and to me, they seem to speak to a kind of disappearance in a role, not just for people on the right, but people who would sort of go back and forth on the left and the right, that they weren't just thought of as like columnists, you know, there's sort of a million, but they were really looked to as people who could not just play like an annoying kind of gadfly role for the journalists and the people in government, but really they were sort of thought as being able to think through this stuff very carefully and sort of argue with each other and work it out. These days, that just doesn't seem to be a thing to me. I mean, obviously I'm a younger person, I'm a graduate student here, but especially when I read the older work by these people like Kristol come to mind, I just wonder, is there really a place for them? And if not, okay, there is. Okay, so then why are young people like myself interested in?
It used to be that there was, first of all, the sector that Bill Kristol made his journalistic career in, weekly opinion magazines. Remember, all weekly opinion magazines since The Spectator started in 1711 have lost money every year that they've existed, and they're always supported by patrons. Anybody who tells you otherwise is lying.
No, I don't,
so it's not an economic thing.
Right.
And you know, I think if a conservative were here, they'd say, well, go read Claremont Review, which is also not market-based. I mean, there are, you know, so somebody is going to pay for a space for more sober conservative writing. It used to be a columnist, you know, it was a kind of gift of the establishment. And there weren't all these self-appointed columnists. Now there are. There's an infinite number of columnists. But I don't think it's impossible for somebody who is, and don't get too nostalgic about George Will. And
oh, I'm not. Believe me, I'm not. I guess I meant the kind of cultural taste, not just for the Wills and the Kristols, but the people on sort of both sides. To me, that doesn't seem to be present in my generation.
I'm skeptical of that.
Yeah.
I think that conservatism, as Peter noted, has changed tonally a lot.
Sure.
I mean, basically, when I first started working in journalism in Washington in 1976, I remember having lunch with somebody in the White House who said, look, you know, Jimmy Carter was president, he said, everybody in the bottom half of the income distribution is a Democrat, everybody in the upper half is a Republican. That's how American politics works. Okay, so that's not true anymore. It's gotten more complicated. So the sort of pitchfork brigade side of conservatism is a much bigger element in conservatism than it was then. But I think, you know, David Brooks, if he's still a conservative, I mean, he's way deep in the establishment, you know, and I'm sure is like having dinner with some senator tonight. And I mean, all that whole world of like Washington dinner parties with pundits and stuff like that. There's also a sort of ecosystem of, you know, people like Michael Beschloss and, you know, public intellectuals who work at think tanks and authors and, you know, so it's like, don't cry for me, Argentina.Ose people will find a place. And I could probably just, we could sit here and spitball a list of 15 conservatives who are sort of not Breitbartian, who are still, you know.
Yeah, although I think what's happened is that the right has, the organs of the right that have developed more power are, you know, are more populist and kind of anti-intellectual, and more very tightly linked to the Republican Party, you know, and so they've kind of had to, they've, you know, and I think on the I think the other thing which has happened, which is good, is that I think if you go back to like, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think if you go back to like 1980s kind of liberals and conservatives, the liberal world was, the conservative world was dominated by white men, the liberal world was also dominated by white men. Now the conservative world remains dominated by white men, but the liberal world has diversified more.
Right.
And so I think you have a larger cultural gap because all this cultural change has happened on the left side. And that in a way has, I think one of the reasons that liberals and conservatives got along better, frankly, was because even though they were ideologically a bit different, they had the same race and gender. You know, like they actually had a lot in common. Now that's like, if you think about now, the debate, you know, is like, we didn't have that many, you know, anyway, so I think that's part of what's happened. I do think that one of the really interesting things to be will be like who can come up with a more intellectually interesting version of some of the things that Trump is saying, you know, and I think that one of the failures, I think, for like the New York Times has been not certainly that you should find a Trump supporter. I don't think any place should be looking for Trump supporters but people should be looking for people who can write, and I think this is like why Reihan Salam is like an interesting person to read these days. People should be looking for people who can make arguments about sovereignty and immigration and trade, which are somewhat new, which have some heft to them, you know? And I think that's a space which will be interesting to watch among conservatives.
I gotta go back up.
Okay.
I have a friend who's retiring, and his retirement party started at 6
Right.
at Columbia, so I gotta, you know.
Fly
Thanks
there.
for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Thanks for coming.
thank you very much. Okay, I don't know where our refreshments are. They did.
Lied.
Screw
They
these
never
people.
did much.
There's
by
not
way of
enough people here for
So
refreshments,
you
clearly.
stopped having the conversation.
You guys are rolling. So wait, what were